I spent a week with the Galaxy S24 Ultra, feeling out all its pros and cons to understand what's really new. I've also figured out its autonomy and how the screen and cameras work. In this review, I'll tell and show you everything. Let's start with the important stuff. The main complaint about the S24 Ultra this year is that it hasn't changed at all. Yes, the S24 Ultra has changed very little, to be honest, even compared to the S22 Ultra. It's practically unchanged, the design remains the same. But you have to understand that this is the classic 3-year cycle. Typically, the next year should bring changes. If you currently own an S20 Ultra or even an S21 Ultra, you might consider upgrading because there are significant improvements. The same goes for the S23 Ultra, which is still very good and now significantly cheaper. And of course, I can't say that the S24 Ultra is the best smartphone at the moment, it's definitely not. But I also can't call it bad or inferior to its competitors. It has its own strengths and weaknesses, as do all smartphones. Technology seems to have hit a certain ceiling, and we're not expecting revolutions. The focus today has shifted to VR and AI. Well, let's see what has really changed in the design of the S24 Ultra compared to the previous generation. The first thing that catches the eye is the screen. It's completely flat now, and personally, I don't like it because I loved Samsung for their waterfall screens. But I understand that some people might prefer last year's S23 Ultra or even the S22 Ultra, where the edges are even more rounded. It's purely a matter of taste. How flat is the screen, really? It has a very slight curve where it meets the side frame. It's comparable to what's on the iPhone 15 Pro Max or Pixel 8 Pro, meaning it's not a sharp 90-degree angle, there's a slight curve. Overall, there are no problems in this regard. But because of this overall angularity, the S24 Ultra feels larger in the hand. As for scratches, it's equipped with Gorilla Glass armor, which supposedly provides better protection against any external impact, but in reality, such a large screen area will still get scratched. And of course, you'll probably need a protective glass. A nice bonus is that with the straight edges now, it will be much easier to apply the glass. And breaking this screen will be harder. In theory. Otherwise, the design hasn't changed much compared to last year. The appearance remains largely the same. It still looks good. There's no feeling of fatigue here. Yes, the smartphone has become slightly smaller in all dimensions, but only by some insignificant numbers. So it feels exactly the same in the hand as last year's model. By the way, the speakers too. I think the sound is about the same level as last year. It's like 1.5 stereo from the main speaker, the sound is slightly louder and fuller than from the earpiece. And in terms of volume levels, well, they're probably slightly quieter. And they're just slightly less voluminous than on the iPhone 15 Pro or Max, you know what? If the design of the S24 Ultra hasn't changed much, then they really worked on its screen in this generation. The first Samsung has finally defeated PWM. Well, not entirely, of course, defeated flickering. Here, the frequency is noticeably higher than in the previous generation, and therefore it affects the eyes less. So you could say it's a victory. Secondly, the screen brightness has increased. In HDR peak, it reaches up to 2600 nits, while in regular SDR mode, the brightness will, of course, be much lower, around 1600 nits. But what's interesting, in bright sunlight, the phone is brighter than the iPhone 15 Pro Max, noticeably brighter. But that's not all. The S24 Ultra display has received an anti-glare coating. Apparently, it's the same coating found on Samsung's new flagship TVs. Many have talked about this coating, but here's what's important. When I first saw the S24 Ultra, it seemed to have some matte film on the screen. Even when turned off, it glares much less than the iPhone or Pixel. Sometimes, when you hold the phone in your hand, it feels as if it's matte, as if it's electronic ink, but without losing contrast. Black remains black. Now I really want this new Samsung TV with the same screen and coating because it's really cool. The second feature is editing photos using generative neural networks. You can delete objects, move them. Yes, again, this feature is everywhere, but surprisingly, in the S24 Ultra, moving or deleting an object works better and even more interestingly than in the Google Pixel 8. There's also call translation. Yes, this is really the rarest thing. Let's say, you'll need it in life, well, probably literally a couple of times, but, in principle, it's cool that it's there. And you can forget about it. There's another fun thing when watching videos in the gallery, specifically in Samsung's proprietary gallery. You can tap and hold the video with your finger for a second, and it will slow down, creating slow motion. This is how the preview works. During video editing, you can also slow it down up to 4 times. And here it should be understood that it's not just slowing down. Here, the neural network creates the missing frames. These are the proprietary perks of this lineup. Here you have the connectivity of the Galaxy S24 Ultra with 4G and 5G and Wi-Fi working much better than on my iPhone, and this is not the first generation I've noticed. Then there's Samsung DeX. You can literally connect the smartphone to a monitor with a cable, and you get something like a desktop. There's also DisplayPort support through the Type-C itself. It's USB 3.2. At the same time, you can also connect storage devices, for example, SD cards. And the phone also supports Bluetooth mice and keyboards. In general, it turns out to be a kind of Chromebook. Write in the comments whose ecosystem you like more. Now it's time to talk about the camera, or rather the cameras. In this generation, there are also 4 of them, but for some reason, Samsung decided to install a 5-fold optical zoom instead of the trademark 10-fold. Perhaps they did some research and noticed that people don't use this zoom much. However, I can say in advance that this new 5-fold zoom is simply miles ahead in terms of quality compared to last year's 10-fold. And I also want to highlight one feature that I liked in the Galaxy S24 Ultra and in the entire lineup: the ability to record video in fully manual settings and take photos in the Expert Row app. So basically, you don't need to install any third-party apps to get higher quality videos and photos. And now, by the way, let's talk about video. The smartphone can record up to 8K at 30 frames per second, but as you understand, such video will weigh insanely much. But 4K at 30 frames per second is just right, and the smartphone shoots quite well. It has excellent stabilization during shooting. In 4K, you can switch between all 4 cameras, and it happens instantly. Though, not always smoothly, but quickly. The only thing to note is the color difference between the 5-fold zoom and the other cameras. Unlike the basic S24, the Ultra runs on the Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, currently the most powerful chip for Android smartphones. Apps open quickly, scrolling is mostly smooth, but with more serious tasks, it's not all that perfect because of throttling. As for Call of Duty, also at maximum settings, stable at 60 FPS. The One UI shell, by the way, is very pleasant, and I sincerely don't understand those who actively hate the Samsung One UI shell, calling it slow, sluggish, and so on. It's not like that at all, at least in my usage scenarios. It's shown to be very smooth, very fast. And these AI features also do their job. I guess there's left to talk about autonomy. There's nothing particularly new from the last generation. No, the smartphone works in my mode for about 8 hours of screen time, maybe 9, maybe a little less. It depends on which programs you use. As for charging, it supports up to 45W, as far as I remember, and specifically in my mode, I usually charge it when it has about 15 to 20% left, and it charges to 95 to 98% in an hour. Well, almost completely. What to say about this smartphone? To buy or not to buy is your choice. You can consider the S23 Ultra. The price has just dropped. After using this smartphone, I decided to wait for the S25 to come out, hoping they'll bring some uniqueness there. There's no magnet like on the iPhone, not everyone uses the stylus, and the Chinese counterparts are more interesting, I would say, but the choice is yours. Bye for now.